Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. It's an absolute delight for us to have Eve Darian-Smith here. She's been with us for the week, together with her partner, Phil McCarthy, who's also here. Eve can be considered, along with Phil, one of the kind of godparents of global studies, I would say. Kind of one of the originators, progenitors, certainly in terms of thinking about methodologies, research, kind of every dimension possible. She's currently a distinguished professor and chair at the University of California, Irvine. Previous to this, she was trained as a lawyer in Australia before doing a PhD in social anthropology. Is kind of a quintessential transdisciplinary person. On top of that, she is an award-winning scholar and teacher, author of 7 authored books, one of which she'll be mainly talking about this evening. Also 7 edited volumes and special issues. In particular, one big book, which will be very familiar for many students here, is The Global Turn from 2017, which is, again, a founding text in our field of study. Apart from that, the book you'll be thinking about tonight is Global Burning, Rising Antidemocracy and Climate Crisis, out with Stanford University Press in 2022, which won the Betty and Alfred McClung Lee Book Award and the silver medal winner in Environment and Ecology of the Independent Publishers Book Award. So we're super honoured, we're super privileged and super hyped to have you here. Thank you very much.
Tēnā koutou katoa. I am deeply honoured to be here and presenting the first inaugural lecture of what promises to be an incredible series of which you are all going to be very lucky to be able to participate in. I really, truly am honoured, and I want to thank Dean Gregory, even though she's not here, for her making this opportunity for me to be here. Certainly thanking Camilla and Kathy. Thank you so much for your very, very warm welcome. Very, very thankful to Chris and all the people in Global Studies who have been so wonderful. But special thanks to Bernadette, because Bernadette really has facilitated our visit here and has been a long-term friend of ours, and it's just wonderful to be here and be part of this event. In trying to get my thoughts together for this talk, it was very hard for me to focus given the daily whiplash of news impacting millions of people around the world under the second Trump administration. I'm acutely aware that we are in an extraordinary moment in US and global history where the very principles of democracy are under direct attack. How we think about responding to the various interconnected crises facing the world and how we talk about these crises with our students who increasingly live in a climate of fear, censorship, and intimidation has been front and center for myself and many of my colleagues at the University of California. In short, I'm deeply appreciative of being here today amongst old and new friends, able to talk freely about power, greed, and rising authoritarianism, and frankly, I will never again take for granted the extraordinary privilege of academic freedom, because truly we are under attack, certainly in the United States. So I just wanted to open up by saying thank you for this opportunity to speak freely, because who knows how long I will and Phil will have this opportunity in our own university back in California. So before turning to the sort of substance of my talk, I just wanted to also outline why we are here. So Phil McCarthy is my partner. And specifically, I will be talking about free market authoritarianism. But why are we here? Sometime around 2015, Bernadette knocked on my door at the University of California, Santa Barbara. I was the chair of the Global Studies department there. And she wanted to chat about the field of global studies. I was very intrigued, wanting to know what was going on here at the university, and we talked about a lot of things. I can't really remember what, but it was very engaged. I gave her some documents that I put together for proposals and so on, and really it is sort of the seeds of what we had talked about, and then Bernadette bring back sort of hopefully an invigorated vision, managed to get off and running the extraordinary Global Studies program here at the university. Under the brilliant vision of Dr. Hilary Chung, what has been achieved here in a really relatively short period of time is extraordinary, with a thriving, large, I gather, 600-strong undergraduate major, and then, of course, an MA and a PhD offering in global studies as well. And so we're completely delighted that this has turned out the way it has. We're completely delighted that our book that Chris mentioned that we wrote in 2017 is being taught in the classroom, which, of course, we want to update. But it is just such a privilege to have this sort of conversation across the oceans and for it to evolve in such a wonderful way with this exciting program. And it's really a success in the sense that we think that global studies is actually the emerging field, not so old, not so new anymore. It's actually been around for a couple of decades. That's really, really relevant to our current times. So this is very, very quickly, but global studies as a sort of field of inquiry problematizes the assumptions and conventional understandings in the Western Academy. We're very, very, very much about plural epistemologies and lifting up voices that have been silenced in the scholarship and literature that has been so dominant for many, many, many decades. Global studies is also very deeply appreciative of the interconnected histories informing the present. Unlike other kinds of politics departments, perhaps history plays, and multiple histories play a very important part of the conversation that shape the current moment. And global studies is very much about embracing global issues, some of which we have not even been able to imagine in the future. So I always say to students, 20 years ago, we couldn't have thought of drone warfare, right? It didn't really come across as a possibility. The future holds many, many, many new inventions, AI, things that you and I can't even imagine, and that we strongly think that global studies is this field of inquiry that is dynamic and flexible and allows students and staff and researchers to grapple with things as they emerge as problems in front of us. So it's a very exciting time to see so much, as I say, that has been achieved here, and how global studies truly is sort of a pivot into understanding the global complexities that currently face us all. So now I'm going to talk about this book, Global Burning. And so I'm actually Australian, so if you were wondering, so my family in Australia think I'm very American-sounding, and I don't sound at all Australian. And my colleagues in the United States say, where are you from? And of course, I've been there 30 years, and I'm sort of like, what? You know, so it's an in-between place that I occupy. But the seeds or the kernels for this book actually emerged in December 2019. I was visiting my mum and family in Melbourne, and just as I was getting on the plane and the Christmas break was about to start, the fires broke out in Australia. And as we know, these fires were extraordinarily horrific, extensive, catastrophic, disrupting everyone's Christmas holes and so on. And I got on the plane, I left mum and family, and, you know, bye. And really early in January, as we know, 2020, the fires were out of control. And this is just to give you a sense of the scale of the fires, the bushfires in Australia, because at the same time as they broke out, there were huge fires in Siberia, huge fires in the Amazon region, particularly in Brazil, and California had just had the biggest bushfires that they'd experienced the year before. So I'm getting on the plane thinking this is really incredibly prophetic, that I'm going from one huge bushfire to the remains of a previous bushfire. And what is happening? These catastrophic bushfires, which we've always grown up with here in Australia and in the western parts of the United States, but the scale and the intensity was something really stark and very sort of startling to me. And I'm trying to think about how do we think about the global phenomenon of a planet burning, right? Because literally, truly, and these incredible NASA websites, who knows whether they're still actually available and up and running for the ordinary person to access, but these incredible data that the satellite beamed down, and you can see in real time where there are extraordinary bushfires around the world at any one point in time. So I'm thinking of fire, which we tend to think is very localized and very grounded in the horrific deaths and so on of individuals and burnt buildings and burnt animals, as something that actually is much bigger global story to be told about them. Here are just some images of the extraordinary devastation and of the Amazon rainforests in Brazil, deliberately burnt, of course, by mining corporations, agribusiness, and so on. Here is the Los Angeles skyline, which, you know, is very familiar to Phil and I with fire in the local sort of suburbs around us, constantly on fire alert. And the horrible fires that we've experienced in LA in the last month. And so I'm trying to compare in the book these three different countries and what is the commonalities between them such that they're all experiencing at the same time these catastrophic wildfires. And really, this is what the book's about. Each of these countries had been, or at the time, were run by extremist far-right political figures. Scott Morrison, who was a complete puppet of the oil and gas industry. This photo, I love this ridiculous photo, who brought into Parliament a lump of coal and made a fool of himself, as you can imagine. The middle figure is that person. And then Bolsonaro in Brazil, right? And these three people are all talking to each other. They're all sharing strategies. They're all communicating about how to make the most of their allies in big oil and big mining, big banks, and pharmaceuticals. So this is just a sort of summary of the similarities of these three countries. Countries shared long histories of colonialism and extractive capitalism. All three governments were against the United Nations and any international legal institutional norms, withdrawing from the Paris Agreement by Trump and other, the World Health Organization and so on. All three governments promoted racial policies that are anti-immigrant, pro-nationalist, pro-white. All three governments supported by an extreme right populist core. And then under the yellow, this is where it starts to get sort of horrifying. They all deny or discredit climate science, calling it a hoax and various other things. They all received extraordinary electoral support by corporations, particularly oil and gas. And all three governments very, very dramatically deregulated and dismantled environmental protections, right? So there's these deep similarities of what's going on. Now, the points there that are not highlighted in yellow, other people were talking about. But I was anxious to show that this is deeper than we imagine in terms of impacting the environmental protections of these three countries. Under Trump, 50 years of environmental protection laws were rolled back. Biden came in, tried to sort of put in a few, replace a few, but really the environmental protections under Trump's first administration were completely gutted, and they never recovered, and now they've been gutted again. So this is, the sort of political landscape in which these horrifying, catastrophic bushfires have to be understood. So the book talks about these two intersecting global trends. Declining democratic governance over the last 15 or so years, and not just in these three countries, but of course in many, many, many other countries, and there's a huge lot of data to show the elements of democracy that have declined globally, and increasing catastrophic bushfires. And, I'm using bushfires, but bushfires are emblematic of other so-called natural disasters, extreme drought, hurricanes, weird weather patterns that have never been seen before. So I'm connecting in the story here the political erosion of democracies with the escalating corrosion of the environment, a sort of connection that is really still not being made clearly, I think, certainly in the public's mind. Since I published the book in 2022, some, slightly positive things on the horizon. Biden comes in and introduces the Inflation Reduction Act, which injected for the first time by a global north, wealthy country, a lot of money into the economy, over $330 million in support of renewable energy, right? Other good things is Lula came into power in Brazil, re-elected as president. Bolsonaro goes away, but not entirely. He's on the outskirts there. But a very, very tight race. But once again, there was a shift of government. And then, of course, in Australia, there's a shift again away from Morrison to the Labor Party. So there is, these things are dynamic. And there are glimmers of hope, such as the Inflation Reduction Act, Biden returning the United States to the Paris Agreement. But despite these little glimmers on the landscape of optimism and hope, we all know that the steady march of the climate crisis is escalating, right? And these are just some headlines. Climate scientists can't talk enough about we are over some, absolutely terrifying tipping points. We are facing code red, right? This is something we can't deny. We actually have to come to terms with. So despite some big injections of money into renewable energy, a different kind of conversation, at least in the United States, the steady march of big oil, oil and mining absolutely escalated even under Biden, right? So despite Biden's position on the climate. So what I want to sort of point out with this image is the wider context of the climate emergency, right? And that's the scaffolding of the sort of international world order that had really come into play post-Second World War, which we have taken for granted all through the 1990s and into the 2000s, is truly trembling and destabilized in the current global political economy. This is the bigger global context of which we have to understand the turn towards authoritarianism. So this image is really just to highlight that we are seeing a global political economy in which anti-democratic leaders are increasingly taking office. This is across Europe. We're seeing the turn to the far right, the Americas, Asia, Middle East, and Africa. The world is experiencing a shift towards authoritarian governance, and this new cadre of anti-democratic politicians are sharing strategies with each other as they gain electoral support and political and economic power. So the 3 case studies, which is sort of just a sort of glimpse in, shows you that there's a bigger network of far-right leaders who are really talking to each other in a way that you and I have no idea about and sharing strategies of authoritarian governance. This is a global phenomenon. As Alberto Toscano reminds us in his very, very interesting book called Late Fascism, which was published in 2023. It's a global phenomenon. Refusing to get bogged down in definitional niceties, Toscano argues that authoritarianism is arrived at differently in different national contexts, but the ultimate result is much the same. And under the second Trump administration, you can see this at a scale and a pace that no one really ever anticipated. So what is common to these anti-democratic governments is a dismissal of law and norms of governance, is a powerful expression of ultranationalism, make America great again, make India great again, and so on, a withdrawal from many of these leaders from multilateralism and international cooperation, as epitomized by the WHO and the Paris Agreement. NATO is under, we all know, extreme attack, NAFTA, and so on. And a disdain, a really profoundly deep disdain for human rights and political and civil rights of their citizens. And, there's been a lot of commentary in the US about the cruelty of the Trump administration and Musk's firing of civil servants and so on. This sort of joy in the cruelty of how it impacts ordinary people. Other elements, of course, we could go on and on, is a capture of the judiciary, a public media that is increasingly limited to be independent, and so on. So in my book, Global Burning, I argue that this growing authoritarianism is being facilitated and driven by an alliance between extremist leaders and multinational corporations. And I call this explicit collusion free market authoritarianism, underscoring that big oil, along with other multinationals in finance, technology, and defense, are controlling national governments through what are, in effect, puppet politicians. These leaders critically depend upon corporate economic support to be elected and to stay in power. And so it's not surprising that they are aggressively defending the rights of corporations to continue their exploitation of people and resources, which often result in devastating environmental practices. So in the United States, this collusion has always or has been present for many decades. I don't want to say that the collusion between politicians and big oil and other multinationals is a recent phenomenon. It's a long history. But the scale and the capacity for oil and big companies to finance through soft monies and through networks of financial support is beyond belief in terms of what a democratic system can cover and can control. This image just shows you and this is the recorded donations by oil and gas corporations to the Republicans compared to the Democrats, even in the most recent election. What's different now is that this collusion is out in the open, it's explicit, and unabashedly no one seems to care, at least within the MAGA Republican Party, right? And so what we're seeing is these extraordinarily horrifying images that are explicitly, wolf whistling to the far right, to neo-Nazism, to fascist organizations and so on around the world. This is the kind, there's our friend Mele from Argentina, and the extraordinary frolics with this chainsaw that we saw very recently. That's what we're currently facing in the United States. I hope that you never in this country face that kind of disgraceful political performance. So unfortunately, 3 years after writing my book, I could not have imagined the salience of the concept of free market authoritarianism to explain the present moment, which has generated unprecedented circumstances that we are all now grappling with in different ways. People in the rich industrialized countries of the global north who have lived in relative peaceful and prosperous countries since the Second World War have, in short, entered a new era of far-right extremism, and this is explicit. So what we're entering is a new era, and this is around the world, of policing public protest and peaceful assembly. So, for instance, in the United States, as the authoritarian leaders of the Republican Party partner up with capitalist oligarchs like Musk, we're seeing a new wave of public protests against those protests against these transactional political arrangements. Civicus Monitor, which is a watchdog organization with global alliances around the world, has been tracking the restrictions on public protests in many countries. And it found that excessive force and detentions of people are rapidly escalating, reporting that among the most targeted and worst affected groups are those advocating for democracy, better governance, and protecting the environment. So they're seeing targeted policing of public protests, specifically when people are walking on the streets and marching against environmental degradations. In the United States, more than half the states within the country have put in these anti-protest laws. They've allowed people to be immune if their car hits a protester on the street. And certainly if you're within, I think it's 100 feet of any infrastructure, pipelines and so on, you could be thrown into jail. In other words, these laws are coming in specifically to protect and defend big oil and mining corporations and to stomp down any public protest against such infrastructure. These laws emerged as a direct response to the Dakota Access Pipeline protests at Standing Rock, which drew international attention for the violent response by police to peaceful climate protesters that included small farmers and Indigenous peoples on whose lands the pipes were laid. These protests were really became very, very violent because the pipelines leaked goop onto tribal reservations, into small farmers. And so there was this unique moment in which small farmers, predominantly white, sided and aligned with the Indigenous communities, and it was a huge deal. Greenpeace has been carefully reporting on these anti-protest laws that include the legal strategy of oil companies using civil lawsuits, which are called SLAPs, to harass and intimidate climate activists and chill legitimate political dissent. And right now, in turn, Greenpeace has been sued by the big oil company Energy Transfer and is currently on trial before a North Dakota jury, exactly where these protests took place.
The award of hundreds of millions of dollars against Greenpeace in relation to that.
Oh, really? Okay. Right. Okay. All right. So thank you for that. I didn't pick that up. Outside the United States, anti-protest laws are equally, if not more so, oppressive, which sort of seems impossible, but there you are. For instance, in Australia, protesters face severe fines of $25,000 and up to 5 years in jail for non-violent acts such as blocking traffic and preventing forests from being logged. Penalties for peaceful action are now the same as aggravated assault in some states such as New South Wales. Similar to what is happening in Australia, across Europe, in Britain particularly, France, Italy, Germany and Sweden, harsh new anti-protest laws have been enacted, resulting in mass arrests and the labelling of protesters as eco-terrorists, rioters and hooligans. And for instance, in May 2023 in The Hague in the Netherlands, water cannon was used to break up a large climate protest, and more than 1,500 people were arrested and 7 activists convicted of sedition for encouraging people to attend a public protest. So that's a new era of policing public protest around environmental issues, but of course around a whole lot of other issues that you can imagine. Another element of this new era is a new sort of wave of land grabs and extractive capitalism. And this has occurred particularly since the 2007 and 8 recession. So in a similar fashion to the carving up of the world by European powers, here's Pitt and Napoleon in an 1805 political cartoon that I love by James Gilray. Today's land grabs have echoes with the past and the past colonial and imperial moments. And there is now a new embrace, which you would laugh at if it wasn't so deadly serious, of these kinds of public demonstrations of buying. And if they don't comply, Greenland, it will be invaded by US forces. So this is a new moment of extreme imperialism in which there's no apology made, echoing the past, but just out there in the open in a way that people just can't understand. And of course, some of you may have seen this extraordinary video about making Gaza a resort. But I think what's also new about this moment is that there's the drilling and the land grabbing of domestic national parks and public lands. So, you know, in the colonial periods, it's about the Western European powers going to other parts of the world and taking their natural resources and mining and cheap labor and humans and so on. Now there is this, where we can't get it all everywhere else, we're just going to take it from our own land. So in the United States, for instance, public lands, public national parklands and so on are all under threat. And of course, the Alaska area is basically being given away to the big oil companies. So I think this is a slightly different sort of aggressiveness, not just an overseas exploitative move, but an imperial move, domestic imperial move to capture the land and resources within the national context. There's another element I want to just quickly turn to. We're facing a new era of silencing climate science and facts about planetary warming. So under the Project 2025, well, there we have Trump denying climate science. We're entering an era of ignorance, of willful ignorance. Under the Project 2025, which, as you all know, was the sort of roadmap that Trump laid out with the help of the Heritage Foundation, very detailed pages and pages and pages of what Trump would do if he got in a second term. It's laid out for everyone to see, and he was still voted in, right? And he's going through it and ticking off what's in Project 2025. One element, and it's very detailed and goes across all different sort of sectors and sort of elements of society, but the Project 2025 proposes to defund and dismantle the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. This is serious stuff, because if you can't monitor what's going on in our oceans and atmospheres, you can't monitor what the impacts of the climate crisis is doing. So basically, it's shutting down climate science at the very core of the US government. The Department of Homeland Security has also issued memos to remove language making references to a wide range of issues, including gender, ethnicity, and so on. But in the context of this talk, it has also required staff to remove words such as climate justice, social justice, climate science, and clean energy. and this is a list of some of the words that are now being removed from all agencies, federal agencies within the United States, and has sent a signal to all university campuses to start removing these words from how they promote their courses, their initiatives, and everything else. And if you just look at that very small amount of words there, it is extraordinary and it's frightening. Clean energy, climate crisis, climate science, equity, quality, equal opportunity, environmental quality, and so on, right? These words are now, and Phil and I, we have not yet had the directive to remove these words from our syllabi, but in Republican-led states, they have. So we have a lot of friends who are like, have you got jobs in California? Because I got to get out of here, because I can't talk about racial justice, I can't talk about gender justice. And you can imagine the staff in gender and sexuality departments and black studies departments and so on are deeply, deeply afraid. These are the words, but we're being told we need to remove. And, you know, I have a different project, a different book that's coming out actually in a month's time called Policing Higher Education, because this is what we're experiencing. Policing the right to pursue knowledge, think critically, and challenge the status quo. It's happening through defunding federal agencies and research funds, book bans, policing curriculum, censoring speech, and restricting student protests on any issue. So this is sort of a component of the bigger political landscape, what's happening within the university communities. And there's lots and lots finally, there's lots and lots of agitation on campuses. Really, it's because of the huge money going to scientific research has really now brought out the chemists and the engineers from their labs, and there's actually, within the University of California 10-campus system today, the 19th, we're the 20th here, but it's the 19th in the United States, is meant to be a mass protest of all staff to come out and march for science and against Trump. So we'll see how that goes. This Orwellian disappearance of words and concepts from the public conversation should probably not be surprising, as I say, because of the attack on universities. And this is a serious, not an abstract concept. So Phil and I were on campus, this is in May last year, and there was a student protest of about 100 students peacefully, protesting the horrors in Gaza. And the whistle went out, the helicopters suddenly circled, 22 external police units were called to campus, over 300 personnel in riot gear comes onto campus. Everyone is told to stay in place as they slowly squeezed in to the area in which the students and some staff were protesting. It was very, very scary, as you can imagine. This is where Phil typically lectures to 400 undergraduate students, the physical science lecture hall. This is his hall. That's what he likes to think. Fortunately, he wasn't there that day, but there you can see the motley crew of students and the riot police in their face. And, it was extremely ugly, and unfortunately, as a department chair, one of my staff and one of our graduate students was arrested, and they're being very much prosecuted to this day. And you can imagine very unpleasant emails I received as chair and so on. So there's a lot of unpleasantness from the public harassing students as well. Finally, I also see it as part of this new era, this new political landscape, a moment in which government leaders are abandoning their citizens, not necessarily willingly, but without any opposition, right? So that notion of cruelty I mentioned before, there's very deep sort of sense of cruelty in which some communities, and most often, unfortunately, marginalized communities, rather racially or ethnically or socioeconomically marginalized communities, are sort of prioritized in a sort of hierarchy of who's disposable and who's not. And this sort of very much reminds me of Akhil Membe's notion of necropolitics, where the sovereign, the king, the Trump master, decides who should live and who shall die. And, I say that sounds dramatic, but it's actually very much playing out in the rhetoric that we're seeing, this complete disregard for human life. And this was sort of in the context of the planetary warming, this notion that people are being abandoned, very much felt amongst agricultural workers who have very limited rights to good conditions. They're out in the fields in California, down the Central Valley, which is producing most of the food for the whole of the United States. No real protections, typically baking in the sun, as it were. And that sort of horror of life and its dismissiveness really, I think, sort of punctuates the horrifying wildfires that we've had very recently in LA. This, I think, woke up the huge, massive metropolis of Los Angeles in a way that I don't think any of the catastrophic bushfires that has always been around in Southern California has, because it was a fire that burnt the city, right? These are suburban streets. There weren't the fancy old Malibu homes up in the foothills where people take a risk. This was just ordinary little houses in ordinary neighborhoods that got burnt, as you've seen the photos, to the ground. And so I think that sort of sense that we've been abandoned, the warming planet, the fires of a scale that no one has ever experienced before, is really sort of part of the fear factor that is very much distressing, certainly our students. What I want to suggest here is that we cannot get bogged down if we can try and lift our heads up from the devastation of these fires, wherever they happen, be it here or in the Brazilian Amazon or in metropole Los Angeles. It's important not to get completely swallowed by the trauma of burnt homes and lost lives and animals and so on. We have to actually keep at the front and center the bigger, wider picture of why we are experiencing these calamitous events and how we may sort of think about mitigating and pushing back. We have to remember that we're in an era of these global transactional collusions between anti-democratic leaders and capitalist oligarchs, right? It's not just one country, it's not just the United States, which is the most obvious example here. It is happening to different degrees all around the world, literally. We have to keep that in the center of what we're facing, and how do we think about confronting that and not get swallowed by the enormous sorrow of the planetary warming process. And I'm going to leave you with this. I think it's an amazing image. This was the phrase was coined by Bill McKibben, who's a very, very prominent environmental activist for many decades. He says, "Money is the oxygen on which the fire of global warming burns." And I think that just sums up. We have to always keep our eye on where the money is, who's earning the money, how is the money being earned, and how are we going to stop this roller coaster of calamitous bushfires.